All right. Welcome, everybody, to another XExamine podcast on this special weekend where there's also the 4th of July that will be happening tomorrow. So we were thinking, as we look back on all the 4th of Julys that have occurred, we can gain a lot of insight from reflecting on the history of the United States as well as the triumphs of humankind in totality. And whether you have a belief that humans have been around for 10,000 years or 200,000 years or 550,000 years, from religious belief to some interpretation of an archaeological record, the initial situation of humans is very different from where we are today. And we'd love to explore that timeline with you all.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's great to reflect on the multitude of human achievements, because I definitely want to add 4th of July and the establishment of the United States on that list, along the same timeline as things like even like the Chinese unification, when, like just thousands of years ago, when China became like a huge unified state. You could say when Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, or when Genghis Khan, plowed through all of Asia in the opposite direction, doing almost exactly the same thing the opposite way. But it's nice to kind of see how, like the history as a whole up to this point, really interesting from the developments of revolutionary thinking in France, which didn't go quite exactly as planned. And then seeing this revolutionary idea take place and be successful in the United States, I think is also really interesting. That we're getting away from this idea of kings and emperors and lords and figuring out individual sovereignty.
I know a lot of people seem to add this attribute to the American Revolution that it was somehow a fluke. Somehow our state of freedom versus subjugation was an accident. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I kind of understand what they're talking about. There's a good degree of luck that's happened all throughout history. There's no doubt about that. I think, though, it is reasonable to assume that because of North America's geographical location, any sort of imposition from across the Atlantic Ocean would have been difficult anyway. So the fact that you have more homegrown people that have been around for more or less than like a few, like at least 100 years since the initial colonization, you had people who are born, like a few generations of people who were born, raised, and have come to grown attached to the land that they were born on. So I don't necessarily think that it was a fluke, because how could the British, no matter how good their army was, really stand up to people who knew the land that they were fighting on? So like it seems a little like disingenuous to call it a fluke 100%. Although I could see a case for saying like they were ill supplied or didn't have good tactics, whatever. But it obviously wasn't the case because they won.
Yeah, I can see those points. Those are good points. And maybe it's a failure to produce an exact series of events that led to where we are now. Maybe an inability to dissect it just allows us to come to the conclusion that, oh, this is just it was just a random event that happened. It makes me think of infinity in math, which just means difficult to calculate. So like
Oh
it's
yeah.
a beyond a limitation of current methods to calculate. Similar to an argument against the human eyes evolving or coming about naturally through natural processes. People say, well, you can't explain it, so therefore must be God. But just because certain individuals might not be able to have a bulleted list where they say, okay, first this happened, second this happened, our failure to explain things doesn't mean that there was not an explanation for them.
Absolutely. I think there is a good, tie in here that we can make then for the very beginnings of humans as a species, because our brains were developed for the area that we are in, like as a product of all the different evolutionary forces that and influences that came there. We weren't like, well, depending on some people's viewpoints, but I'm going to claim from an evolutionary standpoint that we weren't designed to know reality without bias.
Mm. We weren't designed to know reality without bias. I guess we have to have a bias because we are a subset of the whole. So the only true objectivity is if you are the whole, which is impossible to be.
But even then, our consciousness, I would argue, is also a small part of the whole. I think a lot of our brain, the unconscious, is actually uh, like unspoken because everyone kind of rejected Freud. And that's fine. I'm not saying that we should somehow go rediscover psychoanalytics. But what I am saying is that as the executor of your will, consciousness is a like end of the line product from all those influences. So we don't even know ourselves. That's what I want to claim. Like we have information that our brain gives us, but I feel like our brain is actually somehow different from us as like a self. Like we're like a smaller part of that whole because we shut down every night when we go to sleep. There's no will there. I don't will myself digesting. I don't will myself to pump blood, all those kinds of things.
That's true. All the autonomous functions of the body are largely occurring without conscious input or conscious control. We may exert some sort of minor influences, maybe indirectly. Like I'm thinking about a lot of uh, angry things, so my blood pressure can raise, or I see an animal that I want to hunt and I feel hungry, so my body prepares for that interaction. Or I'm thinking about memories that make me happy and clouds and butterflies, and so I relax and my blood vessels dilate and let me relax. So uh, there's a strange bridge between the conscious action and the physiological result of all the other strange processes that we don't have much access to, but which occur whether we think about them or not, like the heart beating
Absolutely.
or breathing, cellular metabolism as a whole. It's my skin's gonna grow whether I tell it to or not. My hair's gonna grow and eventually fall out without any input from me. No surveys will be given.
Yeah, and even in some ways too, like the conscious mind being unable to even do anything about, like, you can't will your cancer away or yourself to lose the amount of weight or to stop being allergic to something. And I'm talking very generally. If people want to make the case that we have proven examples of this happening, well, maybe, but it's just not generally the case. It seems to be like either a certain ability someone has, or at least like they have a predict, like it doesn't seem to me that it's any sort of initial cause. There's no like prima causa or causa prima that is the initial offset. It's more or less, I know it was explained to me by like people who study neuroscience that like somehow your mind is catching up to what your brain already knows.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like you have that initial reaction to be angry, and then your mind says, I'm angry. But it's not because your mind says, I'm angry, that your body responds. It's actually the
Oh,
other way
I like that.
around.
Oh, very interesting. This is like getting healthy to lose weight instead of losing weight to get healthy. So there's
Yes.
a causal mix up there where you should be getting healthy. And as a result of that, there are physiological manifestations of being healthy.
Yes,
And the
absolutely.
same,
It's a really interesting sort of like way to look at it. And I don't know, again, how much of it is 100% accurate. But I think it's advantageous to kind of consider that alternative point.
Yeah, definitely, definitely worth considering those points because uh, if we wait until we are 100% certain of everything, it's actually impossible because there's never this discussion of getting to that endpoint where we do increase our confidence interval. We're more certain of what we believe is happening. And also, this is a pretty magnificent thing to think about because we don't know a lot of the actions that our brain does. Like, we don't know how, we don't understand how conscious thought results in action. We can
Yes,
figure out
or
what
even
parts of the
if,
brain are lighting up.
yeah, yeah, like in the same way that if you ever find yourself outside following a bird or an insect that's flying around, and then you realize only afterwards that you've been able to perfectly see the path of that animal, just like how we were giving that hunting example, without being consciously willing yourself every moment to do that, or like there's some sort of automatic action. One of the like first things I learned about when catching a ball, I was just notoriously inept at being athletic in any sort of way growing up, and learning to catch a baseball and a football were particularly hard for me because I was being too conscious about it. And as soon as my uncle actually told me to relax and not think about catching a football, I was able to catch a football, and then was able to do so without fail, the next like 20 or 30 times, just by having that small insight of just like let it go. Because your conscious mind it's almost like having a serial pathway versus a parallel pathway in circuitry. It's allowing like all these different small computations, decentralization, by the way, to occur without having that sort of chain necessary. Like I don't have to think about like putting my right arm, left arm in a certain position in order to catch the football. I was able to start catching footballs with one hand without thinking about it. Like whenever you have a reaction to something, it's amazing how coordinated you are without being conscious of it.
Very nice. I was thinking something similar about running. I don't think, okay, I have to bend my left knee now raise it while I'm leaning forward, push with my right foot, curl my calf, extend the foot, then, this like very complicated series of events, and your body's leaving the ground when you're actually running between each footstep. So it's a complicated motion that is natural for everybody. And even if you can't run, maybe you're just fairly old at this point in time, or whatever the case may be. If you've ever been able to run, you still have this intrinsic understanding of it, even if you're no longer physically capable of it. And you don't have
Yeah,
to think through like every single little step. And
absolutely. Because it's almost like a reasonable thing to assume too that like that's why it takes us so long in our early years to become like any sort of coordinated animal whatsoever. You look at like babies, you put them down and they have like a recorded stage of development, sure, but it's amazing how like how we come out of the womb just completely inept at everything.
look how far they've come. Like if you
Yeah.
watch someone speak a foreign language, like very different language that you haven't heard before or that is not related to your family of languages, it's almost 100% foreign if you're only listening. Like, okay, maybe you can pick up some nonverbal cues or you can sense the tone, or if you know the situation in which they're speaking, you can
Mhm.
you can try to figure out some things. But that baby learned that language very it was over a couple years or so, but they're just able to replicate the sounds and imitate, and they learned meaning and assigned sounds to them that they also replicate just based on experience and a data set of, okay, this word, I hear this word and then I get food, this must mean food
Yes.
because
I
I've been
think
fed 10 times. They call my name when this organism that appears to be taking care of me looks at me and provides care to me, they say this word the most, so this must be like my name, whatever that
Yes.
means.
And it's like this huge web of associations, which I think also we need to um, more or less like discuss honestly how words aren't necessarily like these objective things because they have to be mapped onto our brain somehow. Exactly which the way that you're talking about, this like association. Because I would even go so far as to claim that words aren't like little individual pieces of data made up of like a certain number of binary that lives equally in everybody's head. I think everyone has a different relationship with a different word that they have to singularly create within their mind.
Mm.
And what
Yeah,
I
no,
mean by that is, yeah, it's just like the familiarity you have with that word and all the different contexts in which you use it and in which it is used is different for each and every individual. So I think that's why when you read more as an individual, you become more, uh, adept at using language overall.
you add the range to which this word can apply. Oh, this person used it in this context. I didn't know it also meant that.
Yep. The more diverse foods you eat and the more that you cook and are able to then from experience learn all the different intricacies of, I shake my hand a certain number of times for salt and it came out this salty
Oh,
versus, other ones. So like there's a whole bunch of that all the time. Like our experiences are amazing because our mind is just unconsciously recording all of these things. And for me, at
oh,
least, I'm not sure if other people have this as well, but for me, at least, if I create a new persona inside my head, like a character who is mimicking an accent, like, like for a comedic effect, but I use that accent when I'm speaking that language, I speak that language better. So if I'm like learning German and I make up a little German guy inside my head that has like that funny German accent that we hear on television, or if we heard native people who have that accent left over when they're speaking English, if you mimic that accent, it actually puts you in a good place to speak and enunciate those words properly, in my
that
mind.
is, yeah, that's actually not the first time I've heard that. I've, when I was learning a foreign language, someone from that language told me that. They said, hey, when you pretend like you have like an accent, that's how we speak. So he
It
was a
has
good
to be
sport
like
about
that's
it.
just a reasonable conclusion to make.
Yeah, there's some sort of overlap of taking native pronunciation rules and applying them to your language and another language and vice versa. Huh, very interesting. And so, as you said, the experience creates a tally, and then your brain has more understanding of the normal distribution. Okay, there's this
Yes.
variation, and most of the time it sounds like this. And then you go to Boston, and they're like, "I pot my can have his yard," and you're like, "What? What language are you speaking, you creep?"
Is this what Dunkin' Donuts does to a man's mind?
So you hear that, folks? Do more than eat white bread. Expand the palate.
But like that's the other hilarious thing about accents too. It's like language is not an objective thing. Language is a great thing that people from the anarchy school of thought use as a way of cooperation. Like, how do you have unregulated cooperation? Well, language is a great example of this. Is that even though we have things like dictionaries and encyclopedias, language still morphs over time, and there's no one person necessarily that's in charge of it or a group of people who are like policing people's language. There is a certain amount of consistency that as a society you want to have because there's a utility for it. Like for example, if I said left every time I meant right, it wouldn't really benefit anyone. It wouldn't even benefit myself, like having that weird preference for mixing up words and what they mean. And yet also I would be able to add that a unique misreading of things gives us poetry and advances us in certain ways too. So it's an interesting sort of balance that we have. It's more or less like things are just shifting around. You can't necessarily say that language has become better over time. It's really just become different over time.
Yes, language, in order to succeed, must be fluid, and it is both an art and a science. There are certain rules that tend to be constant, but those also change. And a language must always be able to adapt to describe the dynamic world in which it is used. Otherwise, it loses its utility. For
Mhm.
example, when texting came out, um, not only did the grammar really change, but people actually did a pretty good job. For as much of a butchering of the language as opponents would probably say that it was, it in it remained intact in meaning for the most part. People really found a way to keep the meaning while revolutionizing how many letters were sent, loss of punctuation, capitalization, really adding in a lot of new abbreviations. And so a language is it's useful because it's able to change. If
Yeah.
yeah, if a term came out and you just refused to come up with a new word for it because you said it wasn't in the dictionary of 1492, then your language is failing to keep up with the times and the changing environments, which is why people have language in the first place, which is to convey information based on the world that you live in, not the world that people lived in 500 years ago.
Yeah, it's an amazing tool that we've developed and keep developing over time and recreating. I mean, thinking too about like how civilization kind of first began with you could say the invention of written language being monumental in our ability to then uh, develop new ways to build upon previous information and not just
And
having to rediscover it for our generation every time.
yes, cumulative language and cumulative learning. So you can always reference things and you don't have to rely on an oral tradition, which is good, but there is a distinct advantage that writing things down has, which is no one person has to remember everything, or you don't have this, for lack of a better term, like an oligarch, like a small group of people that have it among these 10 people, all the knowledge of our civilization rests. So if one
Yes.
person dies, hopefully he had somebody who knew every single thing that he did, which was unlikely. But if everything's written down, it's just such a nice intact record of things that you
Yeah.
can always just build on.
Yeah, it's one of those things that like maybe it started off being centralized and that's fine. That's probably how initially languages almost have to start. But over time it spreads out and because like every time you're talking to an individual, you're almost more or less trading information in some ways, not like in a bargaining way, but like you're also just like unleashing information in the world. Maybe that's a better way of looking at it. When you're talking, you're emanating these sounds, and then whoever's in the area who could understand that language, even if they don't know the full context of everything that's going on, they could pick up on the few words that are being said and all that kind of stuff. So it spreads all over the place. That's kind of just what I'm getting to. It's fascinating too how like and I there's like a modern obsession with trying to get rid of memory, which I think is unfortunate because without memory, I don't think people can truly think. So like there's this weird offloading that our modern society has done in which and that's why I say it's not better, it's different. It's because there are trade-offs inherent with this sort of like text language or like memorizing poetry is good for your mind because you're memorizing large passages of anything. It almost doesn't matter about the poem itself. And I think that's actually the disappointing thing kids aren't taught is actually like, oh, actually just memorizing this shit will make you a more intelligent human being. Because think of all the other things that you could do once you've unlocked the skill of memorizing whole passages of stuff.
I feel like that's the goal as well with math in school.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sometimes the education system has, at least in my personal experience, somewhat failed to properly demonstrate how to apply those skills. So once you have them, okay, well, what do I do with this?
Yes, and I think that it actually has to be done before you learn the lesson. The object of education, I think, should also be to give the person, the just like why is this valuable? Well, this is valuable because of all of these different things you can do, but also this more like meta level observation, which is like, okay, well, if you memorize this poem, it's not so much that this poem in this order will help you. It's the fact that now your brain is used to holding a lot of information consciously at once. And that's going to be amazing when you go off to college and have to do that for all sorts of things, like whether you're learning history, whether you're learning physics, whether you're learning medical stuff, having that access to a ton of information is a useful human skill.
As long as you go to an accredited university. can't can't have any learning at any other institution.
It's absolutely ridiculous. Humans have been learning without accreditation, without, the permission of the state forever. And on top of that, too, like everyone who graduates high school and college now, we get into the real world and we're like, well, fuck, we didn't learn anything, did we? We don't know about business law, how to negotiate a contract, how to open up a business, how to do any of this shit. No, we're just like taught some random ass, problem solving skills that may come into effect when I'm doing a word puzzle. I don't know.
All I know is that John sold Susie a lot of watermelons in math class.
Yep. Just another exercise in the patriarchy. Man, but okay, so we're starting off with this more or less. We're talking about humans as a whole. And now let's see how we start moving towards the 4th of July.
Sure, sure. I will actually start by going even further back in time, which is with your first humans. And life was hard back then. We didn't have antibiotics, so I'm just imagining living in kind of a wilderness type environment in a nomadic gatherer hunter type tribe. And I'm looking at my daughter or my son, my little baby who is sick. Well, I don't really have modern tools to assess the prognosis. Will he or she get better? Will they get worse? Am I going to have to plan for another kid? And life was really tough when people are living in super cold environments. I think about that. And you have frostbite. If you're fighting off some sort of predatory animal, just a single encounter, you might lose a few fingers, which permanently disables or limits what you can do. If you like rip a tendon in your leg, if you slip on a wet rock, then you are functionally impaired for the rest of your life, and you immediately become some sort of burden on the rest of your group. You must now either have some other skill because you can't maybe climb trees to grab fruit, or you certainly can't chase down an animal. Just really think about that initial state of life being so dangerous and difficult and easy to have a stumbling block that for the rest of your life and your group's life is an impediment to continued survival.
Yeah,
And
and I would even say too that like part of human language development, to mix this like kind of all together, also indicates that we were made for not only the ability to lie, but also to detect lies. So it's interesting that for people put inside those unfortunate positions, that they also may have. I'm not saying that this was exactly the case, but you could see that there is a case for, well, maybe because they had to fulfill a different role, maybe that also included the ability to just simply deceive others into thinking that they were important. So they
Mm,
wouldn't be just excluded from the tribe right away. But on top of that, too, it could have just been like, well, now this person ends up being a shaman or ends up being a type of like receptacle for information, a storyteller, and that could happen not only if you became hurt or maimed in your younger years, but even in your older years when you just end up losing those natural functions over time.
and your experience, as well as newfound time, perhaps due to inability to do other things. Yeah, now you can create things like cave art or even the pigments that are used in that music.
Mhm. Weaving, doing all sorts of like tool creation. There was this actual, it was like this, it's almost a beautiful thing to consider too, that we wouldn't just get rid of that person, that they ended up just filling out different roles as they saw fit or what just naturally happened over time, that there was just utility to this person outside of the normal gatherer hunter aspects.
Yeah, the life cycle of the actual life. And in thinking about our lives today, it's an interesting thought experiment to think in those ancient times, if we were to calculate like write down everything that you ate, if you ate like a ham sandwich and you ate like this much corn before agriculture and domestication of animals, if you actually had to go collect those resources or hunt those animals, just how how much we consume for every single person, I just think it would be an incredible amount. And food was perishable and it was not concentrated in one location. So it's really just a modern marvel that, yes, there's still starvation, and I'm not uh, trying to talk that away, but the people who, for the most part, have enough food, there's a lot of people that have enough food. And it's just an incredible result of the resourcefulness of collecting resources and how we have this crazy interwoven system of logistics of some people farm, some people raise animals, other people have specializations in all other areas of life, and then we collectively work together so that everybody gets something. Like farmers have computers, but I didn't invent computers and they didn't invent computers, somebody did. So this collective, we're just this huge collective.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing too because like we also have like executive function. So as individuals, it's like very important to have this individuality because you could expand to new areas um, just through your own willingness that could end up going out and helping a ton of others. Someone had to be the entrepreneur to start the businesses. Like maybe they weren't the person to invent the computer, but they were the person to mass produce the computer or mass produce even something like a common coding language or software. And we can say the same thing about agriculture too, but also like saying that the natural state of humans in the world is an incredibly difficult life compared to now. If you're living in countries where you have a high amount of wealth per person. So, I think it's important for us to kind of like make sure that we understand that hunting back in the day without a gun, without all these different advancements on archery was incredibly different and like most hunts failed and they still fail for predators in the wild quite often. The fact that we were used to not having food rather than having food probably goes a long way to show why we're having problems with obesity in these wealthier areas as well.
Yes, surely uh, you cannot be starving if you are obese. I would find that very difficult to refute that statement.
Mhm. Despite the whole malnutrition aspect, like you could still have malnutrition and be obese, but at the same time, we also wouldn't call that starving.
Yeah, that's fair. There's some sort of interesting distinction there.
I think
But
it's also
if
kind of strange too that we just assume that the obesity is because of a lack of nutrients. I also find that very hard to believe.
that is an interesting conundrum. What causes us to consume quantities of food in such an amount where we are storing that food as fat? Because
Mhm.
if there was not an excess, your body would not be producing it. So somehow, like, because otherwise you would just be, people would be eating and then dying, which they're not.
Yes, so it's definitely like an excess, and we can just give the peace offering of it's an excess in a very singular pathway of a type of nutrient, which you could say like a macronutrient, like a carb or a fat or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. And so we went from that rough lifestyle to celebrating independence and shooting off fireworks to now my self-esteem is affected by how many people say negative things on my social media.
Yeah, it seems like because we've kind of more or less mentally adapted, it's become, I think, almost like an unbearable amount of pain. Like I would say that like there's probably an amount of that that's true. The fact that we're seeing like a pandemic, if you would, of like these I'm going to call them wusses. I'm not going to play around here. It's a testament to how soft life has become, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. In some ways, you could say, "Oh, hey, this actually means that we're doing pretty good as a society," but at the same time, we know that it's threatening in some way because we know that there's like a certain amount of fragility that in case things happen, we've been like more or less riding on good luck. And that luck one day will run out, and we're going to have problems if people haven't subjected themselves to more basic realities of food, water, shelter, that kind of stuff.
This social media and mental health pandemic, as you've described it, also kind of makes me think about suicide. And I wonder if, was there suicide like really in ancient times, like super, super long ago? Not like, but way before like Roman Empire, where there weren't large governments and society as we know it. I don't know. Is suicide like a more or less a modern phenomenon?
I would say that I'm inclined to agree, but I think it's also somehow akin to the cancer argument.
What's the
That
cancer argument?
the cancer argument, more or less, is saying that more people are dying of cancer because they're not dying of other things. And so I could actually put suicide probably into that area as well.
Okay.
But I think there is a truth to just both of these sides. That there's like a little bit of like a survivorship bias, but there's also this element of there's something going on here which like can't be necessarily explained naturally. There's some sort of like uh, it's a mixture of all these different variables. Because I would agree with you. I would say that there's probably been a lot less suicide, um, because maybe they died of other things before they could commit suicide, because there are more things to do in order to stay alive. Maybe just made you not think as much about those other things.
Yeah, and I guess as an assumption here too that I'm just now recognizing. I'm not sure how I would get data on that either. I don't
Mhm.
know how to tell if an ancient human has died through self-inflicted intention. Like maybe they did, and it's like, oh, this guy slipped off a cliff, but maybe he jumped off a cliff. I have no idea.
I definitely think suicide is a unique, um, I don't know if even to call it a problem per se. I know that sounds callous, but like I'm just making assumptions, which is why I'm trying to remove that bias, but maybe I can't right now. But
Yeah, like yeah, what's
the
the mindset?
yeah, absolutely, because one of the most famous books of the 20th century is The Myth of Sisyphus, in which in the very beginning, Albert Camus says that there's only one real problem in philosophy, and that's the problem of suicide. And like the whole first introductory part of the book is trying to explain like what is so different about suicide than other things. It's like this strange willingness to be with nothing, to like not. I think also like people had mythologies for a long portion where they felt like there was a life beyond this one,
Mm,
and so suicide just seemed like an odd, like in a lot of cultures too, the suicide was very taboo. So maybe there were just small introductory pressures where maybe certain like tribal civilizations may have had suicide problems, because it's really odd to think of like all of the history of slavery that's existed on this planet and why there just haven't been mass suicides accompanying it.
that is an interesting position to be in.
It's a really
Yeah.
difficult question to even
Yeah,
contemplate, quite honestly.
yeah, what life situation is bleaker than a life of slavery, of severe manual labor? I'm just assuming like this is probably a fairly accurate description of slavery throughout time, which is manual labor for long periods of the day, probably not great sleeping conditions, and probably your body can be used for sex at whoever your owner's will is, whether with the owner or with other people for additional profits. Like
Mhm.
your hands are the resource, and then the rest of your body is the resource. Probably not your brain, although I guess that's an unfalsifiable claim. I don't know. Maybe some slaves were used to
Yeah,
produce ideas or improve processes, but like if that does happen, I'm sure it was rather rare, if at all.
yeah. I mean, a lot of like if you put yourself in that situation, it's hard to, of course, because we have a large vocabulary that we can use and a long history of media that we've consumed over our lives that have just been able to influence in many ways. But if you just imagine yourself for a moment as like a slave building the pyramids, um, and you weren't introduced to anything else but the oral history as passed down through your family or community,
Hmm.
maybe suicide just wasn't even a concept.
Wow. Interesting. Just this is very painful, and this is how things are, and I guess I'm just
Mhm.
gonna keep building this pyramid.
I'm not going to defend slavery either. Uh, in the modern context, it has no place. But in very early history, if you think about how harsh being in the wilderness was versus, like if slaves were property, that also means that you had value to your owner. You weren't disposable
That's
necessarily.
interesting.
Like if you had a lot of slaves, then yeah, like you would be relatively more disposable. But at the same time, like they still had to like feed you, clothe you, give you food and all this kind of stuff. Probably not still living like the most luxurious life, obviously, but there was like a certain trade-off that was occurring, versus trying to fend for yourself alone in the wild.
The numbers game is kind of reminding me of why, if I can make a jab, why some people were used as mortar in the Great Wall of China. Just a lot of people, and
And it
the
was a
labor was
resource that was available. And like that's something that I think we have to be a little bit more cognizant of. Absolutely. Not, but again, like this is also saying in the modern context, and that's why like we're celebrating the 4th of July, is it's a celebration of individuality too. It's saying that we are valuable beyond that of what others give us. Like there is a value that a, let's say, a slave owner has for the slave itself. But the revolution, I would say, is that more or less individuals are saying that all men are created equal. That's like a really fascinating new, I wouldn't say, well, maybe not a new concept per se, but a concept that finally had a chance to win out
The
in,
realization,
yes, the realization of it. Absolutely.
not just an idea anymore. So the 4th of July is both a philosophical victory as well as a physical victory because people can be much more secure in their person than before.
Mhm.
Um, the Bill of Rights, all of them. uh,
No,
and here
it's
we
like a
are.
really fascinating development from like, okay, so now we went from being just a bunch of separated individuals living in tribes and whatnot, and you can't really tell if the like what the social landscape was of that. We have guesses to how that could have been, but it's not like entirely accurate, I would say, without having firsthand experience. But then like throughout the years when we have access to text, when we have access to other information, we're able to see that like the development over time was like, okay, you have to survive in the world somehow. Our ancestors just chose to survive somehow, and they did. And that's, it requires a different set of morality, actions, a different mindset altogether to be inside that state. It's a little bit like Lord of the Flies ish. And then all of a sudden you have like organized civilization, which then divides people more or less into different castes. And this arrangement, despite as we would see it, utterly brutal, to them was probably an improvement to the former way of living. And we're just continuing this process.
Refinement from A to Z and all the steps. I won't say they're all completely necessary, but it's also something that had to stepwise be refined and improve over time. So maybe there were multiple ways to canoe across the river, but the river had to be crossed. And I'm not trying to say the ends justify the means,
No,
but
absolutely
it
not.
but the 4th of July is kind of like I guess a graduation. Like if you imagine you got your cap and gown, and it's a place where you are both forward looking into the future. You're on that
Mhm.
stepping stone about to step to the next one. And it's also a period of reflection where you can look back at all the accomplishments and the tough times and bad things that do happen. I guess always have a silver lining because you made it and you
Yeah,
wouldn't be as hardened. I guess you're both hardened and stronger because of past actions in the same way that going to the gym and using resistance weights, or not necessarily going to the gym, any sort of physical stress that you use your body for. Your muscles are pulling on your bones become denser, connective tissue becomes stronger, your muscles become thicker, they have more blood flow, they store more oxygen on site, you get more protein fibers, more mitochondria for energy production. So it all makes us stronger and better. And with that historical insight, we know what we would like to change for the future.
yes, because like that's where the experience part I think really comes in, is that we're able to take a new level of awareness to these actions and look at them over time and kind of assess, things that are, and I hate to say like we're not going to use good or bad here, because good or bad, this weird sort of binary language is a falsehood. It's we have to look at things as like actions as being strategic, as having advantages, as having disadvantages, having that trade-off inherent in all of our evaluations, because something that's advantageous in the short run may not be in the long run, and you only kind of figure this out through a type of empirical reasoning, which one could call experience, even though like maybe necessarily the experiment wasn't exact. You look at something that social scientists call a natural experiment, which is like, for better or for worse, we had this happen with these policies or procedures over time, and this was the result.
I like that. And we can say, wow, I like that. Let's keep it. Or you can say, I didn't like that. That was too painful, or there's a better way to do it, or it was just a catastrophe. So then
Yep.
you change in the same way that you have parents. If you, I know one of our friends described it well. If you break it into, this could be a false dilemma or like a false dichotomy, but it's definitely an approach that is used at least sometimes, which is you have your parents and the things that you like, you do the same with your kids, and the things that you really didn't like you do differently than how your parents did it. And that's
Mhm.
a pretty safe strategy for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just almost important in that case. The assumption being that we have to have kids, which I think is an important aspect of you want a better civilization. It's like, well, what you can do, which humans have done this entire time, was make more humans, and not necessarily to indoctrinate them, but to be like, hey, this is what we're working with. And this is kind of what our desired goal is based on this information,
Mm.
and do with it what you will, like whether you are going off into the world to do one thing or another, this is kind of just like our values and where we've come and how we've gotten here, and make with it what you will, because you might have a new idea that I never thought of, that it ends up being the most advantageous idea or just a better one, because I'm already stuck within all my own inherent biases and stuff like that from my experience in life, that maybe your experience will be different, and it will be different. It's 100% guaranteed it will be different.
It's a pretty grand story we all have to tell as a single human species. And we got
Mhm.
rockets, we're flying into space. We have satellites. Just every piece of technology is mind-boggling to me, and the improvements help us have more food. They help us be medically secure. And yes, there are shortcomings in all of those realms. There's not enough food maybe distributed to 100% of the people, or not everyone has the same level of access to healthcare. But just the achievement
Mhm.
itself of that healthcare existing, like, hey, all of these things that you used to die from and they were a death sentence, now you can have surgery. I mean, even surgery itself was not a thing that used to happen, and now we can create this induced sleep and take away pain, and then try to fix someone's body, and then they wake up and then they recover, which is insane to be able to open someone up and fix things. It's crazy that I always think and mention here that you can have a metal box and it uses information and it sends it without wires across the world nearly instantaneously. And you can, us as organisms, unlike any other organism on this planet, can communicate globally by pressing a few numbers on a phone or by typing a few letters on a keyboard. No other organism has that signaling capability, and no other organism is a symbiote with artificial intelligence, with a digital piece of circuitry.
Yes, and on top of that too, I mean, like the fact that like you and I are having this conversation, being like live recording thousands of miles away from each other right now. And it's like, not only is that fact incredibly impressive, I think it's important to stress to people too that it's a bit fragile. It's not like just this permanent new law of physics. Is that the
Mm.
structures and stuff that we have by the laws of entropy have depreciation
And
and require upkeep.
yes, and our society has a lot of people who like to be termites. There's some people that just want to watch the world burn, and they're just
Yep. Well, this is actually a really good point, too. I would claim that there's such a thing as cultural degradation or cultural depreciation, which has to be maintained and upkeep over time. So there is like a natural case, I think, for conservatism because we have progressed so far. This weird thing that we have to get rid of anything at all that it's also really dumb because I think a lot of the people now who are those termites who want to see everything burn are like they're idiots because they can only think in strange binaries that like because it's this way the exact opposite way would somehow be like paradise on earth, and that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's not because like you create a lawnmower and then completely invert every single aspect of it would somehow make something that works.
yeah. That does seem to be the case for some of these individuals. That is a tragedy, and I'm not sure how to reach those people. I guess with just the slow dissemination and distribution of information and plant seeds to change ideas. If you can change hearts, you can change minds. And if you can change minds, you can change hearts. So maybe a multi-pronged approach because everybody
Ah,
learns in different ways and everybody
mhm.
experiences things and draws conclusions. And if their data set is changing over time, then the balance can slowly but surely be tipped on the teeter totter of tentative conclusions in the dynamic world that we live in.
Absolutely. And we were talking about this earlier too. And I was also talking about this with my friends earlier this week. This idea that more or less, and not to like rag on what you said, but this idea that we have to have some sort of centralized approach, I think is a major flaw in the way that we've been taught to think that from this strange godlike or dictatorship like monarch position that we would be able to affect change if everyone just did everything I said. Instead, I think people need to realize, looking back through history over time, that what's actually helped us the most is having more people. Simply put, because people, the human capital itself, having more minds working on problems creates
Mm.
solutions faster, creates iterative solutions at a much higher rate. The
Oh,
entrepreneurship element is the most important element in the economic calculation. It's not the fact that like the uranium was already here, the gold was already here, the silicon was already here on Earth. It's not a matter of access to resource. It's the utilization of those resources in the wider context outside the production of that specific thing that gives us the real advantage. It's not just the fact that we can produce a computer, it's the fact that we can produce parts of a computer, ship it all the way across the world. So a few more things can be added to it and have those pieces shipped back to another place, which finishes it and then sends off the finished product to everyone else.
that's amazing. And it's making me think of Neil deGrasse Tyson describing one of the most marvelous things about humans is that we are not made of anything special. Everything that we are physically made of also exists elsewhere in nature.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow, in the composition and orientation of all those molecules, and perhaps something else more mysterious, we are sentient, conscious organisms with volition. And I also agree with your idea. I subscribe to that philosophy that more brain power is generally good and results in more solutions being achieved at a greater rate. So, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I just watched a video that came out a few days ago by Kurtzagat, and nobody will be able to spell that probably based on my butchering of that pronunciation. So the name of that video is The Last Human. a glimpse into the far future. And it humorously identifies and talks about this exact concept and extrapolates it. It says, how many humans will there ever be in existence? And they look at how long other species of animals have existed and whether that could be applied to us. What if it doesn't apply to us? What if we become a spacefaring species or a multiplanetary species, or even creating artificial planets to live on? And if we can extract um, the components necessary for our civilizations and sustenance from comets, from meteors, from other objects in our solar system, or even in our universe as a whole, how many people could there be and what could we create? And that would, it's a really interesting video and would really be a perfect um, corollary or addition to
I'll have to
thinking
check
about
that
how,
out.
yeah,
That
pretty
sounds really
interesting.
interesting. Yeah, it's I mean, I'm just thinking too, like from just a pure reason standpoint, the ability of individuals, let's say like you have a community of biologists, and the sheer level of specificity that they can get to is really advantageous and interesting. Like, can you imagine like the first time in recorded history that humans would be able to see a full life cycle of an animal, one that comes into existence as a new species and leaves? Like we would learn so much from that one aspect. And we're kind of monitoring this now. We just have biologists who naturally flow into areas that some, study turtles, some study zebras, some study bats. Um, and it's fascinating that like this sort of interest um, just sort of naturally occurs. But this is, I think in large part due to a free society in which we are liberated more or less from the previous sort of like just base survivalist mentality that we had to inhabit for most of our known history. But that sort of cumulative knowledge and cumulative learning and capital over the years has been, quite substantially amazing in what it's been able to achieve. So
Very well said.
I really do find uh, the sort of ideas to destroy this thing to be absolutely abhorrent because I find such beauty in the way that it's been achieved so far that it creates such an emotional feeling in me. This idea that somehow we have to destroy all of these things that have worked for us just because you think that emotionally it'll make you feel better is absolutely ridiculous. And we shouldn't take any of these individuals who promote those sorts of theories seriously at all. At all. They have no track record here. As George Orwell said when him quoting him quoting a famous Stalin quote, the Stalinists saying more or less, um, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And Orwell replying, "Where's your omelet?" It's this sort of like and it's not to say that their ideas are necessarily wrong. It's that they don't seem to understand any of the mechanics that happen in the larger sociological context involving economics. They're using an outdated economics model which has been, you know discussed and absolutely ripped apart top to bottom. It does not work in natural experiments that you could find throughout history, nor does it make any reasonable sense once you understand the certain mechanics of what happens in society. Like the fact that the four main recognized components of production of anything, which is like land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, everyone learns this in like economics 101 or business 101 or whatever. It's the fact that all of those are non-homogeneous and that our diversity here is our greatest strength among all of those levels. The fact that you would somehow want uniformity across there and somehow make assumptions on your model that would include and rely on that homogeneity is ridiculous. You can't make people equal. No one is equal. And that's our greatest strength. Like to do that would make us like bananas.
Mm,
bananas being that monoculture, that mono, what is it? Because like there are some sort of clones of each other or
yes.
something like that. And so like a disease very much affects the entire population of bananas because they're not differentiated. Whereas if you have differentiation, literally how evolution works, then it'll work. Which is why I think like disrupting the market so much with all of these different regulations has really butchered the relationship that people have with discovering what works and what doesn't. Because there will
Uh,
probably be better solutions in a more natural form. I think like everyone is indoctrinated with this idea that laissez-faire economics does not work. And we've learned this in like 10th grade history, and yet no one's seemed to like question it since. But the fact is that the marketplace is just where people interact. And so if like you confuse those things by saying like, we're going to subsidize this and tax this at an extra rate, it's you have butchered the mechanism in which people understand how things should work. And what I mean by that is that businesses need to go out of business in order to provide that information to the rest of the public that, hey, this setup doesn't work. This was our natural experiment that happened. We're glad we did it, but it didn't work and we got to try something else.
yes, I completely agree. Propping up zombie companies that are not just unprofitable as some companies are for a while, but their plan is to recoup their initial investment and they would otherwise and do eventually become profitable. It's that this model is a losing model and will continue to be a money pit until eventually people realize that and are burdened enough that it's a huge, huge loss by the time the artificial props fail. That I'm trying to think of like a boat that is on a dock. It's being created, but it literally has huge holes in it. So no matter what you build on top of that, when you release that boat finally into the water after all that investment, that boat is going to sink. and
Yeah.
and you're talking about other artificial means of affecting things and like subsidies, and that is why like spinach is more expensive than a piece of ham, which is crazy. That something that just pretty much uses sunlight and soil and nutrients that are also in the air and carbon from the air. Well, the things that eat that, and then the things that eat those things that eat that are somehow cheaper when it doesn't make any sense from a resource perspective. And then also another point about the interesting zoological phenomenon of humans living longer, it does provide us an interesting opportunity as we watch the life cycle of other animals. If it were the other way around, we would not have the same insight. Even from pets that we have that some people see as members of their own family, like dogs or cats, hamsters, fish. I mean, their life cycles are relatively short, especially for some of those animals compared to us. So we see the entire baby to adult to geriatric to death cycle, and we get to learn from those experiences and we can do something with that information. But if we had a life cycle of 2 weeks like a fly and everything was outliving us, it would just seem like a world of static, of like not changing. Things would not be able to change as much because we are changing much faster relative to our environment. So it's interesting that other life forms are on like fast forward compared to us, which gives us a
Yeah,
special vantage point.
absolutely. Absolutely. And to mix this again with the business aspect, like because things in society are so recyclable, and I mean that in a way that, well, not recyclable. Let me change that. I'm sorry. I'm going to say that things in society, because everything is more or less an interaction, it's not like you're literally burning up money when you try an experiment and it fails. So, for example, company loans out its money. We're going to assume hard money here. So, we're going to assume that new dollars don't just magically get printed by some sort of specific centralized authority that we should get rid of.
Give me
Um,
more commercial paper, more
but
green rectangles.
let's say this was done in actual gold. So we have a real economic framework to use. Okay, so you have a factory that's built to produce widgets, widgets that no one wants. So this company quickly goes under. The building still exists. The workers who made that building exist and have been paid already. The loaner lost that money because that money all went to, you know, furnish things and for all of those capital goods, more or less, that have been distributed across this project. And those workers are able to take home gold and then spend it for all the different things. So people are still being paid. It's not like you just lose a mountain of money and then society is worse off. You have people who are more or less already paid, like the people who wanted it to succeed because they had a certain vision, are, sad because their widget factory really fell through. And this sends so much important information throughout the whole thing, though. It's saying that people at this scale do not want this widget, even this widget was useful for something, let's say. People are not willing to pay this price right now for this thing. Um, so maybe in the future, maybe it has to be a bigger scale in which you have people actually at a price point in which they'll pay for this widget, which is acceptable, because everything isn't compared to everything else. So like we're kind of going back to originally what we said with that mind map, that sort of like association web that we have with language. That's how everything works in our society. We have this huge web of people get paid to do things, and then they pay other people to do things, and all of this stuff just kind of gets passed around. And yet a lot of things, end up being um, built, used, developed. Loaners will look at that factory and being like, maybe we should be a little bit more conservative because we don't want to just loan out money that we don't see a return from. And the person who starts the business probably learned a lot from the experience too, and like, maybe I need to figure out while I'm recouping all of this, because like maybe they have to sell the factory to recoup that money. So they sell it at a certain price that hopefully, someone pays, gives them money so they can give their loaners back some money, make up the little difference or whatever. And then they try again with something else. It's a really good way, I think, to organize society around because it is so natural. Money predated capitalism. That's a really important point that people need to realize, that money mechanics work because they're a natural human institution like language.
Hmm,
It has
I've never
been
heard that.
invented and reinvented all throughout history, and it's been improved upon. People used to transact in shells in certain islands, but the thing is that that was unsustainable. When we don't trade in shells now because we know shells are inherently worthless, where they only have a certain amount of worth. Gold, on the other hand, what makes gold so advantageous is that it's more or less uniform when you melt it down, so you can transform it pretty easily. The fact that it's made in the heart of stars is also very helpful. That we physically can't forge gold out of lesser materials to make them more valuable. And even if we could, that would be the new calculation because everyone would know that you could do that.
Give me more star vomit.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason why we don't transact in diamonds is that diamonds of different sizes and different compositions have different worth. They're not uniform like a metal could be. So this is why metal naturally evolved into a form of money that was very sustainable.
Very interesting. A natural human institution
Yeah, yeah,
as a
absolutely.
concept.
Yeah, or you could say natural human invention. Maybe institution was a little too strong because then it kind of implies like a centralized force or something like that. But like in the beginning of the revolution, the real purpose of mints was to certify gold, stamp it, and then people could use it as currency. So people would bring the raw gold or silver or whatever that they found. The mints would certify it, put their stamp of approval on it, which was literally melting down and stamping it. They would take a little cut because that's part of the transaction that you do. And you actually have a way in which the market creates money that's sustainable, because gold, being such a heavy, dense element, is because of the way that it has to be formed inside supernovas. There's only a certain amount of it. And even if you found a shit ton more of it, I mean, it ends up like working out. Yeah, it'll be priced differently. And you might have a little bit of a problem initially, but eventually you know, the fact that we're constantly talking with one another, we're not waiting for centralized authorities to more or less do everything for us. We're adaptable in such a highly competitive and diverse way that the 4th of July holds a special place in my heart, because I think it's the recognition of the fact that diversity is our strength. And the fact that we are a melting pot as a nation kind of shows that we recognize this value in the individual, that we're not just here for human capital. We're something that's even more valuable than that in the long run.
Even fireworks themselves are an interesting display of human ingenuity. I believe the different colors come from different compositions of metal, and when the different metals burn, they produce the different colors. So then if you have different configurations of different metals together, then you get different shapes and different explosions and a different visual display, different levels of sound. So it's both beautiful to look at and also a beautiful creation of what went into it to create them. And it's cool
Absolutely.
because
And
we
like,
know that there's a small element of danger, which is always exciting.
and necessary, that's the adventure of life. The adventure of life needs to have a little bit of danger. This softness and this overprotection is because again, like this danger element is giving us experience that we use as insurance. And I think that's an idea that I think maybe we need to propagate a little bit more, is that the utility of things being dangerous is that you have a lot more people who are experienced and ready in case something dramatic and disastrous happens.
So our ability to face danger in in the most dynamic of all environments is extremely advantageous for our species, and we are instinctually rewarded for seeking out learning from those experiences. So I went to go see Jurassic World the other day. I paid to go see that movie, but I would not go pay to see a movie of people standing, just standing, not saying anything.
Mhm.
It's because it's exciting. It's dangerous. It's and I'm learning, and I can be like, I can imagine myself in those situations. Oh, what would I do? Would I have done something differently? And this is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I think for me, it brings me great joy to see stuff like just think of the spread that you have at a 4th of July picnic. You have hamburgers and hot dogs, which are more or less like a German creation. You have like barbecue ribs, which were invented by the blacks from the American South with their invention of barbecue. I mean, most of American cuisine, we have to admit, came from those influences. The fact that we have like corn on the cob, which was the native grain here. It's just like there are so many amazing influences that as humans and as Americans, we'd like to adopt. It's not cultural appropriation. It's like recognition of someone else's culture as being amazing and something that we want to include in ours.
Oh, I
It's
really like that.
praising, yeah, it's really praising the world, and how like we recognize that there is this idea of maybe like aesthetics or pleasure or whatever you want to call it, beauty, that kind of exists beyond the tribalism. And the fact that we want to incorporate all these things into our life, it's because we value that thing in and of itself.
The benefits of culture and society and technology are to be shared with across the globe with all of our other human populations everywhere.
Yeah, and the fact that we actively include it, I'm not saying that there isn't racism. I'm not saying that there isn't like intolerance for these sorts of things. What I'm saying is that if we focus on the celebration more, we will be able to include more people, and hopefully include the people who are like, I want to include the people who are at this point in time intolerant, because I'm hoping that my interaction with them will change them, and they will be able to see the benefits that I see, and therefore make them more tolerant.
It's very
Exciting,
tragic.
like, yeah, like, well, that's how it works. I don't know any sort of like situation in which you've yelled at someone for so long that they haven't become pathologically, like, they might have become pathologically obedient, but to become naturally accepting of that thing, I don't think so. You do that through friendship.
If the Wright brothers said only Ohioans can use airplanes, so that would be sad. Yeah,
It
gotta
would.
share inventions. People that
Yeah.
create electricity or anything really. So yeah,
Yeah.
everything's a nice shared, uh, like different degrees of sharing makes everything that came after it. I'm thinking of like Italian cuisine. We think of it like, oh, I'm thinking of pasta and spaghetti sauce, but tomatoes came from South America and pasta's from China. So,
Yep. And like, I'm even thinking of like the pierogi of Poland, or, Ukraine. You have potatoes that came from South America.
oh yeah, yeah.
The fact that potatoes spread all across Europe to the point where people actually think potatoes came from that area, even though they haven't.
That's pretty incredible. That's like
According to the science that we've been taught. Again, like, I don't know. I don't really know what's true or not anymore.
that's fair. Hey, that's why we're here. We're here to cross-examine. And thinking about horses, a lot of artwork depicts Native Americans on horses, which did happen, but it wasn't always like that. Uh, my understanding is that horses were brought over from Europe, and then here we are.
They escaped. Yeah, it was a big event actually, because it was the Spanish that brought over the horses, because they're like specifically Arabian horses. And so like there is the whole history involving the Iberian Peninsula and all of their sort of like conquests and inquisitions and all that kind of stuff. And there was like a huge incident where like a ton of these horses were bred in South and like in Mexico, and then escaped, and then the Comanche tamed them and
Oh, that's
became like
cool.
the greatest warriors of that area.
I think I remember reading something not necessarily about that, but about the horses themselves and how there are no wild horses in the United States. They're all considered feral because they were once domesticated and then became as close to wild as can be, but they're not wild, so they're considered feral. So then they were, yeah, re-domesticated.
Mhm.
And then we have our conception of like, oh, they where did this like horse riding idea come from? Or at least where did the horses themselves come from? I don't know who invented horse riding. As a action.
And like reinvented too, or like simultaneously invented, like the fact that like steam engines were all kind of invented at the same time, even though they popped up in like a bunch of different areas.
Oh, I didn't know that that was co-invented.
Yes. Yeah, there's been a lot of instances where that has happened throughout human history, which is like testament to just like how, it doesn't take any sort of centralized authority to give you permission to invent. Just go invent. And
Oh,
our strength, I think, comes from that sort of dynamic freedom, that extreme dynamic freedom that I think encapsulates the best parts of the wild freedom that we've had since, our earliest prehistoric sort of times. And then having the dynamic social systems that have developed over years. It feels like we're finally meeting, almost like we had a path that diverged long ago that we're coming back to. And I feel like that's the real American dream. The real American dream is that you can have a real life of freedom, adventure, and purpose without any sort of coercion or being priced out of anything. But we need to get our economics straight. As long as we do that, as long as we start pushing, I think people need to recognize that we've had so many laws passed in the past 60 years that you need to realize that like we're not getting better off because of those laws. and we need to do a mass amount of repealing. And this will make us more adaptable, and will be able to increase the welfare of all people more this way. So if like you're morally driven to help people, it's actually in your benefit to do this.
That's pretty inspirational. I like that. Also, when everybody's watching fireworks tonight, we have a lot to think about. We have a lot to appreciate. We can look back into the past of our own lives, our culture's lives, human civilization's lives, and we can look into the future and we can look into the stars beyond where the fireworks are at. We have a lot of options.
Absolutely. I would, in my last parting uh, note to our listeners, I would like to say that remember that our founding fathers of the United States intended for our written documents to be limiting what government can do to the people, that your freedom is inherent, that we live in the natural wild world, and that all of our instincts and written law is negotiable. So exercise your freedom this 4th of July, and let's build a great country together.
It is we the people. And
It
we the
is.
people, we the people cross-examine. Yeah, that's